Good afternoon. I'm Lauren Gustus, Executive Editor of the Sacramento Bee and West Region Editor for McClatchy. Thank you for joining us for this discussion about disinformation in local elections, which remain the focus for McClatchy's 5 California newsrooms, even as we acknowledge the country is in the thick of a momentous race to the White House. America's architects viewed the press as essential to our democracy, including it in the first article of our Bill of Rights. And yet today we are testing what a post-news world looks like with consistent attacks on credible information. Factual reporting is being replaced by Russian bots that publish false information into our social media feeds. Local journalists and California news organizations continue to do fact-based reporting 7 days a week, all hours of the day. They're reporting on how coronavirus is impacting us by zip code and what school districts are doing to ensure equitable access to remote learning. This week, they are covering the latest in a series of wildfires that have torn through the state. And we've never had more people reading our stories, viewing our videos, and listening to our podcasts, because local news has never been more important. It is the last bastion of credible and trusted information in today's media landscape. And if we are going to tackle disinformation, we have to start here. And you can help. Today, we'll share examples of false information at the local level and strategies for spotting it as you look to make the best possible decisions for your community come November. We'll give you a roadmap for spotting false claims and help you learn how to set the record straight. We've brought together an impressive group of experts from academia and technology, local reporters and policymakers to discuss how we can navigate with confidence an election unlike any other. Before we begin, though, another thanks to you for making the time to join us today or for watching on demand, for investing in local news, for sharing your questions ahead of time. We've incorporated many of them into today's 3 sessions. You'll leave our time together with tools that will enable you to spot disinformation and effectively navigate conversations with others about what is fact and what is fiction. And we ask in return that you encourage others to support local news. Send them the link to this live stream. Ask them to subscribe, print or digital. The more our subscribers continue to grow, the more news that we can get to. So let's begin with our first session. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Pan, a pediatrician and state senator based in Sacramento, who will offer a first-person perspective on disinformation related to legislation he introduced last year. He's joined by Hannah Wiley, political reporter for the Sacramento Bee, in this first session, could be section, either one. Hannah reports on the state's housing crisis, education, and equity. So, Dr. Pan, I'd love to learn a little bit more about what happened and what you learned from your experience with disinformation as you introduced legislation to tighten California's immunization laws in 2019.
Well, thank you so much for having me here as part of this panel, and really appreciate the Sacramento Bee and McClatchy sponsoring this very important event. When I introduced my bills to improve vaccination rates, I would make note that vaccine is strongly supported by the science. It should not be a partisan or political issue. But what we found out is that there was a lot of disinformation that was out there about vaccines, and that the people who were perpetuating it were very interested in trying to shape the policy debate, but shape it in a way that was based on falsehoods and deception. And so I think some of the things that we learned was that, first of all, disinformation, well, we may go online and we see things on there and we may have some skepticism or lack credulity around it. It does have real world consequences. And when I talk about real world consequences related to the vaccine bill, it wasn't just about people not getting their kids vaccinated. It was also about the way people spread disinformation or misinformation about the legislation, that actually led to bullying of whether it's policymakers, but also supporters of the bill, of physicians and families who had wanted to share their stories about how the diseases that we were trying to prevent affected their families. They would often be silenced by that. And then also the role that social media played in actually helping accelerate the spread of disinformation. And I do appreciate that. We had the media's out there trying to correct a lot of this, but the role that social media played in basically accelerating the spread of this disinformation in a way that made it difficult to keep up in terms of fact checking. And unfortunately, what you heard then is that not only were people who were spreading these conspiracy theories out there talking about them, eventually that was even picked up by some of the legislators themselves, and they would repeat them in whether committee hearings or on the floor. So this does have very real world consequences in terms of not only shaping our policy, but affecting people's lives and putting people at risk.
Dr. Pan, I'd like to ask a follow-up question, and this is a question from a reader, and I think it's absolutely related. And Amber has asked ahead of the session, we requested that folks share their thoughts with us. So Amber has this question for you. She wants to know what recommendations you have as we look to reverse the decline of public belief in science and medical advice.
Well, this is really about trust. So I like to say that science is true whether you believe it or not. So the science will always be there. But this is an issue of trust. And unfortunately, misinformation tends to erode trust in institutions, whether we're talking about government, whether we're talking about scientists, whether we're talking about the media and the press. And so I think one of the things that we need to really try to understand is that who are these people who are trying to spread this misinformation? What are some of their motives? How do we better identify them? So when they come across our social media feed, and you're seeing it actually perhaps shared by a friend, right? It's not necessarily it's coming from some unknown website. That's a challenge that happens in social media. Or you get asked to join a particular Facebook group, and in that group, this kind of information is spread. You need to think about what are some of the, how should you best respond to that? And again, I think, we do need to find ways to restore trust in our institutions. And unfortunately, there are people out there who try to erode that trust as well. So we need to think about what does it take for you to have that trust in the science, in the scientists and the institutions that support it.
You make a great point, and I know we're going to get to this later in our conversation, but how do we talk to friends and family or those we might know who are sharing disinformation? And I know that that's keyed up for session 2, so we will tackle that, and I'm eager to do that. Hannah, I've got a couple of questions for you from readers again, and this one comes from Ray, who's looking at the ballot, which we will receive very soon ahead of our election on November 3rd, and he wants to know how we can determine what is disinformation regarding the California propositions. So what is false and what is true?
That's a good question because there's a lot to know about each of the dozen qualified measures. And there's a lot of money and political talking points spurring the campaigns. We at the Sacramento Bee often do fact checks on what the campaigns claim and whether or not the statements are factually accurate, a bit skewed, or completely false. It's part of my job to break down that political jargon and actually put that sometimes very confusing language into normal people terms so that we can all understand what these campaigns are actually trying to do or change or create. So that's a really great resource, local news and politics teams looking at the ballot campaign language. And then if you're someone who does enjoy those analyses and the political language, the Legislative Analyst's Office does offer some really great nonpartisan rundowns of the ballot measures that I often pull a lot of my information from too.
That's great. I've got a question from Karen for you again, Hannah. And Karen's interested in how you vet your sources. And she says she is horrified that, as Dr. Pan mentioned, people distrust what should be legitimate sourcing. So can you tell us a little bit about how you do that as we look to rebuild that trust and help people understand what we do?
Yeah, that's really a big challenge. part of the job is in this landscape of mistrust around the media. First, it's just important our sources have credentials, whether from infectious disease experts at top research institutions or election experts with years of experience studying voting patterns. You just trust people more when they have experience to their name. And I'm not saying that every person that I talk to has a PhD or some top academic title, because most of my important sources come from local organizations or nonprofits or neighborhood leaders, legislative advocates who work directly with the communities I'm writing about or understand how policies will affect these very real people. But it's also critical to know why someone's talking to you or reaching out to you, especially during campaign season when ballots are happening and candidates are vying for an election win. I always want to know what kind of spin I have to untangle before I actually get the truth. And the best thing you can do as a reporter is try to fact check something via multiple sources. So official documents, campaign finance records, polls, nonpartisan surveys, studies, research briefs, as Pan mentioned, scientific evidence, and then other interviews as well. So the more sources you have, the better. As a reporter, it's negligent for me to see something online, especially in this era of social media, and then take one source's word as 100% accurate without cross-checking that. When you want to have multiple avenues to arrive at the same truth conclusion.
Let's stay on the election. And this is a very specific question, so I hope the audience will forgive us for asking it, but perhaps others are wondering. And I think it took you a bit of time to track down the answer, but Whitney emailed us and she said, if you choose to vote in person on election day, do you need to bring your mail-in ballot with you? And you tracked down the answer. Hannah, let us know. What do we need to do?
Yes. Okay. So I asked the Secretary of State's office this because it is complicated right now, especially with a lot of misinformation around the Postal Service or mail-in voting. So yes and no. And I'm going to make this really simple, or try to. First, the Secretary of State's office encourages you to bring your vote by mail ballot with you if you're going to vote in person, so you can surrender it there. If you live in a county with vote centers, you do not have to bring your vote by mail ballot, and the center should be able to print you a new ballot because they're able to electronically check your participation history. So if you live in a county with a vote center, you don't have to bring it in. However, if you live in a county with traditional polling places and you don't bring in your vote by mail ballot, you'll have to cast a provisional ballot so the elections office can verify your registration.
Super helpful. Thank you. Dr. Pan, I'd like to stay on election day, or the election period, if you will. I think we're all pretty well aware at this point in time that it is not going to be a single point in time. And I wanted to ask you for your perspective on the best way that we can prepare to vote responsibly so that our ballots get counted. And this is a question that's come from multiple readers. But in your experience and from your perspective, how do we ensure that we're doing right by the process and the system if we live in California?
Well, first of all, I want to say that unlike what's been reported by some people, voter fraud is very rare in our elections here in the United States, including in California. In terms of casting your ballot, as you heard from Hannah Wiley, there's many ways to do it. Everyone is going to be mailed a ballot here in Sacramento County. We've done this for several election cycles, and you can either mail it in, you can drop it off at a drop box days before the election. The county website will indicate which dates and which locations are open, or you can go and vote in person at a vote center or a polling place as well. So we do need people to come out and vote. Voting is a critical part of being a citizen in this state and in this country. And I think you should have confidence that your vote will count and that your vote matters.
And California has demonstrated that it can effectively count
Yes.
the votes, both by county and statewide, for years now. So thank you. I appreciate that, Dr. Pan. I want to pivot back to a place where you have expertise that is unique to the group that's joined us today. And that is with respect to our health. And this question comes from Jean. Jean is asking, how do we get people that believe the pandemic is all hype to understand that it is real and that they are contributing to the continuation essentially of it. So she's interested in, okay, how can we again tell truth from fiction with respect to the pandemic? What would you encourage Jean and others to do?
Well, what I encourage her to do and others is to continue to share and spread stories about the pandemic. Unfortunately, one of the challenges we have is with the pandemic is with over 200,000 dead in the United States, and that number continues to grow, COVID-19, because of patient privacy issues and other very important things. We don't necessarily get the story of everybody who's died, and sometimes what happens is that it's sort of happening out of sight, out of mind. Now, it's certainly not out of sight or out of mind for the families that have been affected, by the people who are taking care of these patients. But we don't necessarily have pictures of bodies piling up in our neighborhoods because of COVID. Now, unfortunately, social media has given a platform for people who spread disinformation, who are saying that this is a hoax, or there's one of the more recent myths, which actually has been traced to QAnon as well, or tied to them, is that the CDC actually reported that the number of deaths is much lower than what was previously reported. In fact, this was actually stated on the floor of the state Senate on 2 occasions by state senators, made reference to this, which actually turns out is false. And so that's very concerning when something like that happens. The fact that it's gone from conspiracy theorists to actually leaders in our community repeating these myths. And so one of the things that I think we need to be careful of is when we're looking at social media, not to repeat things that may not be true. If we hear that from other people that we know, we may want to challenge them gently. I don't think you don't need to get into a fight, and you don't need to get into a fight with the trolls either. But unfortunately, this has real world consequences. And one other point I want to make, though, is that we do need to think about the role of social media in spreading disinformation, whether it's about COVID or about elections or other things. Because, like I said, social media does accelerate the spread, but also, and I know the next session you're going to have a conversation about how do you tell the difference between disinformation and the truth, and what can you do about that. But we also have to keep in mind that these are multi-billion-dollar companies who are constantly actually performing psychological evaluations of people's responses to their platforms, doing the A/B testing, other types of things. And that's what we're up against collectively. So each of us can do what we can on our own, but we also have to recognize that we're up against this. And at the same time, I mean, that's another important role for media like the Sacramento Bee, to help people be able to distinguish between what's the clickbait and the conspiracy theories they may be seeing on social media, and what is the truth, and providing that kind of analysis, because we all unfortunately don't have the time to do all this analysis by ourselves. So we do need help.
Great point. It is an organized effort, and we are single incumbents, if you will, right? And understanding that helps. I'd like to ask you just to follow up. You were working on a number of pieces of legislation coming out of your experience with disinformation with respect to the immunization legislation that you look to make reform on in 2019. Is there a role for the state to play in moderating what we see on social?
Well, I think certainly there's a role for government to play. And well, perhaps it mainly should happen at the federal level. We certainly have a role in the state. A lot of these companies are based here in our state. But we also have, each of us have a stake in having a functioning democracy. And with everyone being a participant in our democracy, or they should be, we need to be sure people have access to accurate information. And so when we have social media that isn't responsible for spreading misinformation or disinformation, it actually has real world effects. I mean, this is not just something that happens virtually and online and that's it, right? This unfortunately has real world effects. And we need to be sure that we protect our community and our democracy from disinformation that erodes trust, that undermines our ability to collectively act, which is what we're hearing from the question about COVID, right? We need to collectively act to be able to stop this pandemic. And when we're not able to do that, people are dying from this disease.
Yeah. I want to build on a comment that you made, which is we need to be able to know and what is real and what is false, so to speak. And I would add that we also need to know what the reporting channels are for disinformation. And that was a thread for a number of readers who shared their thoughts and questions with us ahead of time. So this is the last question I'll ask, and I'll ask Hannah. And the one question that I bookmarked is from a woman named Lucinda, and she wants to know how she reports fake claims. How does she report disinformation that she sees either on social, via ads on TV, via a candidate website? I understand that's a complicated question. We might not have answers for all of her in all of those places, but please share what you found with us.
Yeah, so it depends based on the content that the claim is based, but the Secretary of State's office encourages anyone who suspects inaccurate information on advertisements, social media posts about the election and voting in particular to report that information to VoteSure at sos.ca.gov. The office made sure to let me know it doesn't regulate political speech, but rather focuses on baseless and factually inaccurate information about voting and ballots that discourages people from their civic duty, from casting their ballots.
Great. Would you repeat that for us one more time?
Yes. VoteSure, VoteSure at sos.ca.gov.
That's great. Thanks, Hannah. And I know we'll put that link in the chat. We'll also put a link to a one sheet, tools that you can use to spot disinformation as we move forward. And we'll leave that in the chat, and we'll reference it here as we move on through sessions 2 and 3. But before we do, thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Pan, for an inside look at false health-related information and what we can do, and Hannah for the high utility help that you gave us as we look to navigate this election. Thank you. We are going to kick off session 2, and I'd like to introduce moderator Gil Duran to lead the session for us. Gil is California opinion editor and former staffer for California Governor Jerry Brown, Vice Presidential candidate and Senator Kamala Harris, Dianne Feinstein, and others. He's also worked with linguist George Lakoff and is uniquely positioned to identify disinformation. Gil and panelists will share tools and tactics for spotting disinformation and what we can do about it. Thanks, Gil.
Thanks, Lauren. And we do see disinformation a lot in elections these days on the national and international levels, but we do also see it on the local level. One example that comes to mind is that during a city council race last year here in Sacramento, a political group put out flyers and mailers that made it appear as if the incumbent council person, a progressive Democrat, had been kicked out of the Democratic Party. The material also insinuated that he was someone who endorsed Republicans, might be a Republican himself. None of it was true, but the councilman did go on to lose. And though it's not clear whether the flyers and the mailers had much of an effect, it was clear that even on the local level these days, political actors will resort to disinformation in an effort to win. So it's not just Russian trolls on internet farms, it's people who know that by giving the wrong or false impression, that they can reach a lot of people quickly and maybe affect their thinking or their vote. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how disinformation manifests in general, but also in local elections, and give people some tips for how to spot it. My guests on this panel are Jevin West, who's an associate professor in the Information Lab at the University of Washington and also the co-founder of Data Lab and director of the new Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington. And Kim Nalder, Dr. Kim Nalder, who is a professor of political science at California State University, Sacramento, where she serves as the executive director of Cal Speaks, the Cal Speaks poll at Sacramento State, and directs a nonpartisan voter information organization called the Project for an Informed Electorate. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So I think the first question we'll start with is, why are we so susceptible to disinformation and false information? What is it about stories, regardless of how untrue they may be, that catch our imagination and travel? Dr. Nalder, let's start with you.
Well, it turns out that we are programmed essentially to want to be social creatures. And so we want to fit in with our groups. So that's a big part of it, is this group identity. And one of the things that makes it really difficult to dispel, because people are getting their information from their members of their group on Facebook or on other social media. So that's one of the things that makes it difficult. But we also have lots of cognitive biases that we're all subject to. And a lot of times people like to think other people think in ways that are flawed, but not me. But it turns out we all do. We have these, constant cognitive biases, like repetition tends to make us think that things are true. And so that can lead us to believe that things that we've heard multiple times from, false sources or disinformation that's purposely planted even is true. And so we're subject to, all sorts of cognitive biases like that. Including motivated reasoning is kind of the biggest one that political science looks at, which is that we want to come to a certain conclusion ideologically or emotionally. And so we seek out information that confirms that, sort of along with confirmation bias, right? So we seek out information that confirms it, and we ignore the information that's counter, or, things like fact checks that might be really important for us to understand.
Thank you. And Professor West, you got something to add to that? Why is disinformation so seductive?
Yeah, Kim gave some great answers. As humans, we're flawed. We have these weaknesses. If I have a chance to share, a post about the nuances of the tax bill, or a story about a dog biting a man, or man biting a dog, that's much more interesting to share. But in addition to these human frailties and these software bugs that we have in our brains as humans, we have right now a technology system that exploits those weaknesses. So as Dr. Pan mentioned, there are billions and gazillions of experiments, A/B experiments going on right now to figure out what colors and what phrases you're more likely to click on, because the objective of these big social media platforms, there's one objective, and that's to glue your eyeballs to the platform, to sell ads, to make it more likely for you to sort of click on those ads. And so you have this really sophisticated machinery that knows a lot about our psychology, probably knows more than the psychologists themselves. And we have this massive influx of information like never before. Never in human history have we had the amount of information at our fingertips that we do now. So there's information exhaustion. And so then we become, prone to our weaknesses, and we have all these experiments and all of these great headlines to click on that sort of fit our narratives and our biases, as Kim mentioned. So it's tough being a human discerner of truth and information right now. It's difficult, and will probably only become more difficult.
Thank you. And you touched a bit there on my next question, which is, what are the places where we're most likely to find disinformation? I use the example of mailers or leaflet propaganda in a local campaign, but it seems like these days there are more efficient methods for delivering disinformation to people directly. Dr. Nalder, let's start with you on that question.
Well, as Jevin is pointing out, there are all sorts of algorithms that are delivering misinformation to you really effectively. One place that I wanted to point out that kind of ties into the last session is the voter information guide that you get from the Secretary of State's office is excellent in that the secretary or the legislative analyst's office does an analysis to, some professionals who are very good at their jobs, analyze what the impact would be and so forth and provide that to us. The problem is, though, that there's a pro and con section there, and that is not necessarily truthful. It's people who are advocating or opposed to the initiative. And so, misinformation could creep in a place like that where, you're primed to trust it, and you should trust most of it, but that pro-con section could be problematic. So there are places where at the local level, it can sneak in a way that we might not be ready for, in the way that we are nationally, if we're sort of, primed to push away information that we know is coming from the Russians or so forth. But it could be coming from, people more close to home.
Professor West?
Yeah, so I can tell you the times in which we see misinformation and disinformation most often, and that's during times of uncertainty, in times of crisis, in times of, major world events like the US election that's coming, and certainly the pandemic for sure. So it's during those times that opportunists and propagandists and professional conspiracy theorists make most, I don't even want to use the word progress, but that's where they are able to sort of grab our attention the most likely. So I would say it's during times of uncertainty. It's in every kind of information medium. I mean, when we track this in our center, we see it, of course, on social media. That's the data that we collect the most, and that's what we know the most. But we see it in all forms. We see it in text messages and email. We, during the early parts of the pandemic, we saw misinformation and disinformation coming in forms that we hadn't seen as much, at least when comparing it to previous crisis events. So you see it in all different forms, but it's typically around events where there is uncertainty. We don't have all the answers around the current pandemic. And certainly there's a lot of uncertainty around this particular election. So we're going to see a rise in that as well. So I think that's when people need to be sort of most aware and have many of their red flags ready to plant during those certain time periods.
Great. So with so much disinformation available in so many different formats, what are some tips for identifying disinformation online, especially when it comes to things like elections or like public health, in a crisis? How can you spot maybe a piece of information that may not be true? Professor West, let's start with you this time.
Sure. I mean, there are some basic things we can always do. We should always ask, who's telling me this? How do they know it? What do they have to gain from it? So asking questions that investigative reporters do. I mean, we all have to be investigative reporters now, even if we don't have the training that, a lot of the journalists that we have on this particular panel today, but we need to be asking those questions. If it's something sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, it generally is. Actually, I just had my lecture today to my class where we talk about calling BS, spotting it, and refuting it. And students are great at that if you really sort of remind them about these kinds of basic tools. Now, there are other things that we can do too. We can always be doing reverse image checks. We can do, we can checking the source and the ownership of a new media channel. We can certainly find out whether a certain influencer has been known to spread misinformation. But what we're seeing also at the sort of strategic level, so when we talk about disinformation and we think about disinformation, we're generally thinking about it as a campaign, not one single piece of news that can be refuted, not one piece of fake news, I guess people would say. But in those cases, we see all sorts of things like falsely assigning intent. So there's been a lot of news around mail dumping and narratives that are building around that, when actually it's incredibly rare. And when it does happen, and it does happen sometimes, people will then say, oh, it was a Democratic news person or a USPS employee or a Republican one, or they use false framing so that they pull a video or a story from another time period or another locale. And you also see a lot of strategic amplification that happens timed at exactly the same thing. And we actually just put out an article in our new election integrity partnership with Stanford University and our new Center for Informed Public that we just published a couple days ago, talking about several of those examples. So I think people need to be looking out specifically for the kinds of narratives, meta narratives that you see throughout these different kinds of events. And certainly there's the narrative around election integrity, which is a big concern because, as others have said on this panel, the election fraud is actually quite low.
Definitely. And Dr. Nelder, how about you? How do we spot disinformation?
Well, a lot of the key things have been covered already, but one thing is to have good sources of information and kind of know which sources are trustworthy in doing good journalism. Good journalists will consult multiple sources for their stories and verify it, as we heard in the last session. So mainstream news organizations, public TV, public radio, national newspapers tend to, do good journalism. They make mistakes sometimes, but mostly they're giving you good information. So looking at those sources. And then the other thing is a lot of times you'll see a story, and I find myself doing this. I'll see something on social media and it's like emotionally compelling. And when that happens, I'll check and see if it's reported elsewhere. If you just see one source, and especially if that source is one that you've actually never heard of before, or it sounds kind of made up, it probably is. And so if you check around to some mainstream sources, if it's really that, a super compelling story, they'll cover it. They have every motivation to try to get the big stories and get them out quickly. And if that's not the case, it's probably pretty fishy.
Thanks. Yeah, I've noticed a trend lately on social media where something happens and people are immediately on Twitter complaining that no one's covering this. And my first thought is, well, they're reporting it out before they just jump on it. You got to report the story first. We can't just have it, start putting it on the front page without reporting it. Now, the next question I have comes from Suzanne, who is one of our readers, participants who wrote in with a question. But I want to preface it by saying that I think all of us are having some of these experiences in our lives. I had a friend last week who posted online on Facebook some very complicated article from an outlet nobody had ever heard of, saying that the virus came from a lab and now it's proven. Totally false, totally debunked. I immediately went in my DMs and said, you are making a fool out of yourself. Here's all the Snopes debunking of this. Please do this yourself before you post. Then at the beginning of the pandemic, a relative very close to me excitedly texted me to say that, did you know if you gargle with lemon juice and hot water, it'll kill the coronavirus if it's in your throat? And I had to call the person and walk them through why that was false. Turns out they had seen a meme on Facebook. And so a lot of us out there might be dealing with people who are close to us, who are friends, or who are family members, people we love, people we know, people we trust and care about. And we have to find a way to pull them out of the disinformation vortex occasionally when they get caught in it. So the question from Suzanne is, how can we best approach friends and acquaintances about disinformation they're unwittingly repeating and sharing? Dr. Nalder, let's start with you on this one.
Well, one thing that probably most of us know from experience does not work is direct attack, right? So if you, especially if you feel emotional about it, you feel strongly about it, and they feel attacked or chided, or like you think you know better than they do, it can be humiliating, and so that doesn't work very well. And just providing a fact check is a great idea, and we should do that, because that there are all sorts of organizations that are very credible doing that work. But one of the better techniques, if you actually want to have any hopes of changing their mind, is to ask them some questions. So what makes you what makes you want to believe this, or what information did you get? Start to sort of do Socratic method, asking a bunch of questions. And people don't take kindly to attacks to their worldview, so they're more likely to accept information from people that they trust, or especially people that they trust on their side of the political aisle these days. So if you can find some information that comes from someone that they might trust more politically, that could be effective as well. But ultimately, it's not easy, and we've seen every comment section on every article, and everybody's social media feeds is full of people trying to do this. Clearly, it's not easy for us.
So approach with empathy, care, and questions.
Right.
Professor West, anything to add to that?
Yeah, Kim gave some really good advice. And I think the big thing is it's just really difficult. I live and breathe this every day. I do research around it. I write about it. I teach about it. And I find it really difficult when talking with close friends and neighbors. And I grew up in a small town in Idaho and now live in Seattle. I've seen both sort of worlds, if there are such a thing as two worlds in the United States. And it's difficult. And I think approaching it with empathy is one of the most important things you can do. Also, try to directly talk to the person rather than do it in public. I think, picking up the phone if that's possible and getting out of that social media world. Also understanding that we all make mistakes, but we also share a lot of values and perspectives that get kind of pushed to the side around particular issues that really I would like to see those rise higher to the top. That, let's say you're talking about the pandemic. We all want people to be safe and healthy. We all want our families and neighbors safe and healthy, and we want the economy going well. So we can start with a set of common values and then go from there, and then ask the questions like Kim had mentioned, as a way not in a lawyerly way, but more as encyclopedian or something that's just curious. So do it more in a curious form than in attacking or a way that sort of shames their character or worldview, as Kim mentioned. But it's difficult. It takes time. And I think one of the things we're not doing enough is investing the time to talk with people. I think being online all the time has eroded that ability to just talk and be humans together. And that's one of the things we can do, just start the conversation.
Great. Thank you. And we have time for one more short question with short answers. So I'll preface it by saying part of my work with Dr. George Lakoff was focused on critiquing the media's addiction to repeating falsehoods, which made Trump very powerful and probably contributed greatly to his election as president. So where are we now in 2020? Have we gotten better at that? And what are things media outlets can do to avoid spreading disinformation, even if it's spread by people like the President of the United States? Let's keep the answers kind of short because we're about to start the next panel. And let's start with you, Professor West.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having this panel. I'm a huge fan of journalists, and they're the big antidote. But I would quickly say it's something we are concerned about in our new center, that there are times when we find things that are disinformation campaigns or misinformation pieces of news, and we really ask each other, should we bring this up? Should we further amplify something that doesn't need to be amplified? And also the big thing here at stake is trust. And so if we don't want to further erode trust in institutions, we need to take it serious every time we want to talk about it, even when we have panels like this, because ultimately, even though, let's say, society is struggling right now, or even science has some issues, sometimes even though I'm a huge fan of science, it still works. And I think we have to remind people of that.
Thank you. And Dr. Nalder, what can the media do better, or are we doing better than we did in 2020, or in 2016 and 2020?
I think media outlets are aware of the issue now, and there are more efforts to do things like this program or fact checks and so forth. So in a way, yes, but prevention is much better than trying to cure it or trying to treat the problem. So if something comes out that's misinformation, or especially if it's coming from an elected official, warning the viewer or the reader ahead of time that is the case. If you're doing correcting with the truth sandwich, right, where you give the proper information, the wrong information, pointing out what's wrong about it, and then restate the proper information so that you've heard the proper information more times and you're not just repeating the misinformation. So you can't just take out the misinformation, you need to replace it with something. And so another thing that works for inoculation is to tell people what the techniques are that disinformation folks use. And if you're aware of those techniques, and especially if there's a specific one that's being used in this example, if you can tell people about that ahead of time, they're much less likely to absorb it in the first place. And that's really key. Once we absorb it, it's very hard to remove that information and have people not rely on it once they've heard it.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear you say truth sandwich. When that idea got started, we were like, this is a hopeless task. And now that's really penetrated thanks to Dr. Lakoff and CNN and Brian Stelter's help. Thank you both for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. And now we'll throw it back to Lauren Gustis, our executive editor and president.
Gil, thanks very much. Thanks for the conversation all. As a reminder, we have prepared a fact sheet that you can reference and share with others. It's printable. We're going to link to it now in the chat. The URL is sacb.com or modb.com or fresnob.com/spotting-disinformation. We'll also share a link in the thank you email you will receive if you registered for this event. And finally, it's posted on all McClatchy, California websites. So you can find it on any one of our websites on the homepage right now. We're going to move on to session 3. And I'm really excited for this because we're going to take a look at what things may look like after the election. Our information system has changed so rapidly. And we have Ashish Jamin and Jim Boren to help us understand what might come next. Ashish is the Director of Technology and Operations in the Customer Security and Trust Organization at Microsoft, and he focuses on the Defending Democracy program. Jim is the Executive Director of the Institute for Media and Public Trust at Fresno State, where he teaches journalism. He founded the Media Institute after retiring in 2018 as Executive Editor of the Fresno Bee. Welcome, and thanks to you both for coming. So my first question I'd like to ask you both, and Jim, why don't we start with you? We're seeing, as we learned in the last session, a lot of information coming our way. We've got so many opportunities to intake, right? And we might be hitting this information exhaustion point, right? And my question is, what do you see for us post-election, right? At the individual level, what happens to the consumer, if you will, of information? If you could make some sort of, if you would, I don't want to say prediction, that's not firm enough, but maybe it has to be. Take a look at what the next year might bring for us with respect to disinformation, please.
Well, right after the election, it seems that, if there is a long count, we're going to have an information vacuum, possibly, so that disinformation is going to really have an opportunity to take off, and you're going to see a lot of people pushing disinformation at that time. And I think that news consumers and the public really have to understand what's going on. And the goal of the Institute at Fresno State is to empower the public. Media outlets and social media platforms must identify bad content, but we can't forget that users can stop phony content as they see it right at the site. So we must give them the tools and to use that. And I think on our site, and there was some great information in the previous segment about how to identify fake news and phony content. But we need to put this on the shoulders of the public, because we can do all the things with media outlets and social media platforms, but if we don't get the public to buy in, we're going to lose this battle over misinformation and disinformation. So I see a long count having opportunity for the bad actors to push a lot of misinformation. So the media and others need to push hard at having good information. Elected officials need to be really transparent about their count and letting us know how many ballots are out and all that kind of thing, so we have confidence in the system. Elected officials, if they go silent, it could be problematic for trust.
Thanks, Jim. And Ashish, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is looking at what happens after the elections, but we actually are seeing the trailer or the preview right now, right? As we approach the elections, we see a lot of misinformation essentially coming at a very fast pace, and the amount and the sophistication of that misinformation is improving day by day. So what happens after third, I think, we'll see more of that, right? So instead of it dying down after the election day, in fact, I think that not only it would grow, but also it would grow or increase in sophistication. One of the examples that we've been actually looking at is synthetic media or deepfakes. And I think what we see right now is we call it in the industry cheap fake or shallow fakes, which is miscontextualizing or maybe splicing the video, putting some audio, but it's still not that sophisticated. As we move from elections, after the elections, and if we even go further than the elections, I think that technology improvement actually would also, in fact, would make the problem worse.
That's a great transition. I want to ask you a little bit about what you're doing and what Microsoft is doing. And I'll preface it by saying this. We know that people don't go online every day to post the earth is round, right? But there are people who do go online every day to say the earth is flat, and here are 10 reasons why, and here's a deep fake video about why the earth is flat. And so how do you combat disinformation, and what does it look like from a tech standpoint as we move forward?
Yeah, so one thing I can tell you is like technology solutions are super hard for this problem, and the speed and the scale that disinformation spreads today, it's very hard to keep up from a purely technology perspective. With that said, there are a couple of technology work streams going on that we focus on. One is, can we detect misinformation, disinformation using technology alone? So detection is one of the things, but most of the detection would happen after the information or bad information is created, or at least has seen the light of the sun. Essentially, it's out there. The other thing on technology is authentication and provenance. Essentially, can you figure out, or authority of the content? Can you figure out where it is coming from? Can you actually find a bad actor before they start pushing the disinformation out? And the authoritative content is the work that we have been actually working on, both from a technology perspective, but also making sure that our platforms, we have search platform like Bing, which understands the value of authoritative content and would only surface it or at least rank it in the right way on our platform. So that's it, just from the technology perspective. But Microsoft, we just don't look at this issue area from a purely technology perspective, even though we are a technology company. We also look at this issue area from a media literacy perspective, saying, hey, and we have talked about that. Media literacy for us is one of the most important countermeasures. If we can empower people to be critical consumers of the media by putting our tools in their hands, as well as the journalists, and putting our tools in their hands, we can have a more discerning populace. So we are working on media literacy aspects of it as well. And then the third thing, we also look at policy. Microsoft has the right kind of policy to identify and treat misinformation on our platforms, but we also collaborate with other technology platforms in a very meaningful way, that if there are opportunities to share those signals, then we should be doing that too.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Jim, I'd like to ask you a question about the delineation between what's happening at the national level and what we're seeing locally. We are aware of foreign actors who are distributing disinformation, certainly. But what have you seen with respect to domestic individuals and groups that are engaged in the current election campaign or those prior?
Well, we've seen on a national level what's going on. We assume that that's also going on the local level. I mean, one of the reasons that some of these bad actors, what they want to do is cause dissension in our country, and they've been successful in pushing that. So we could expect that to be at the local level. We see this now, and we've seen it for a long time in political ads. McClatchy and some other newspapers have done a great job over a long period of time, well before technology had taken over, to fact check political ads. And so that would dissect ads, and this is the charge made by this candidate, and this is what really happened, and this person did this, but what we point out in news stories that this doesn't happen. So we are seeing that. We see it all the time. And I think the biggest problem is in the kinds of advertising that we have continually, and that's been an ongoing problem. And I really want to reiterate the point that was previously made about empowering consumers, because they're the ones that really need to have that power to understand what's happening, and so they can make the right choices. We do not really teach media literacy in this country, in this state, in the San Joaquin Valley in the way that I think that we should. It should be a required course. We spend more time on financial literacy and other kinds of things, but media literacy, which impacts everybody from their finances to their politics to their health, is not being taught in any great way. And this is one of the great failings of our education system right now.
Yep. I agree. We're over here saying, yes, more media literacy, please. I do want to ask you, Ashish, about anonymity. And this is a reader question. It comes from Peter. And he's asking if the anonymous nature of social, or our ability to be pseudo-anonymous, if you will, is an issue with respect to disinformation, and how might we work around this? So the example he uses is he says Nextdoor, which ties a user account to a physical address. Is that a solution, right? Are we, so talk to us a little bit about anonymity and what you're seeing.
So I think that may be a solution, but that is not the right solution in my perspective. And the reason is then we are thinking about in a very narrow lens of disinformation, but we also have to think about in terms of privacy. If you start, so privacy is one big issue. We can talk about at length, why it is. But I think we understand why we should have an ability to be anonymous for that reason. The other big reason, which I see, especially in the context of politics and elections, is, we're talking about, if you look at across the globe, this is one of the tools, disinformation is one of the tools for even authoritative regimes and the government in many places to actually suppress dissent. Right, or make that propaganda, and if you remove anonymity, you are actually challenging dissent in those countries, or in some of the other places. And then the last thing I'll say is, what about activists like human rights activists, which are actually in places, even journalists, right, where you end up being in places where for that period of time you have to be anonymous. So anonymity may not be the right solution. I think the right solution at the end of the day is being responsible consumers of information, and the things that we do on both sides, right? One on the platform side, technology side, both on social media, can they be responsible in how they treat misinformation on their platforms, but also on the consumer side, understanding that it is our own responsibility and we don't want to be the problem. So let's be more literate. Let's pause for a few seconds before we start sharing on those platforms.
That's a great suggestion. And you may have answered this next question, but I want to give you the opportunity to do so again in case you have other thoughts or suggestions. This is a reader question, and I'm aware of the irony of asking this reader question, given that there are hundreds of people, if not more, watching on Facebook right now, watching this session on Facebook. But Gehandra asks, what should we do about Facebook? Now, I'd like to broaden that question and ask you, with the full acknowledgement that it's not just social, but social presents a lot of opportunities, right, for disinformation. Is there one thing that we could advocate for our social platforms changing or adjusting or doing as we look at disinformation into the future that would help, right? Like what's a thing? And you just mentioned like think before you post, right? Pause before you post. Are there other actions or activities that the platforms themselves might engage with that would be helpful?
Well, I think the biggest challenge right now is the free nature of social media, right? The business model conflict is huge. And as a consumer, I like free, and I've been now shaped or to consume free on the internet, whereas everything else in life is not free at all. So if you consume information free, there are some effects, and this is one of those effects. So I think if we were to find a better business model, I think we may hopefully be able to solve it a bit.
That's great. Jim, do you have quick thoughts on one thing that the platforms might do?
Yeah, I think that, I'm really skeptical of whether or not we can stop the platforms doing the kinds of things that I think some of it is irresponsible, because there's all sorts of legal issues to that. But if we can make consumers more media literate, if they use more critical thinking skills, if they understand what they're posting and the kind of information that they're devouring and the kinds of what they're pushing out on their social media platforms, that's the end that we need to do. Because I think that we can stop misinformation, or at least slow it down, where we have a good discussion in our country about politics and policy, if we understand the kind of content, whether it's factual and whether it's not, and don't push out phony content. And I think most people, once they understand it, one of the things that people have done is that when they push out misinformation, they think it's not misinformation or disinformation. They don't know that they're being used by that. So we've got to give them the skills to understand that. And I think that's the real answer.
That's correct. You're right, Jim. As individuals, we are up against $1 billion disinformation economy. And while the delivery mechanisms are changing rapidly, the best tools remain personal in nature. As Ashish mentioned, let's think before we post, right? Let's hit that pause button. I can't thank you enough for joining us. Thanks to all of our panelists this afternoon. You who are watching, you who are listening, you can help others understand disinformation by using some of the tools we discussed today and other tactics. The one sheet is available at all McClatchy, California news sites and in the chat. The session has been recorded. It's available for replay. Thank you for your support of local news. Please encourage others to become supporters as you are. Have a great afternoon and a safe and secure election.